I want to tell you something that happened to me personally, and I've never actually said this out loud before. A few years ago, I got a raise, a real one. Not the cost of living adjustment that barely covers anything, an actual, meaningful raise. I remember the day I found out. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office, and I just felt relieved. Like something heavy had been sitting on my chest for years, and someone finally lifted it a little. And then 6 months later, I was just as stressed about money as I was before. Same bills, same feeling of running out of month before I ran out of paycheck. Same quiet anxiety every time I opened my banking app. My income went up, and somehow my life didn't change. Not really. And I started asking myself a question that I couldn't shake. If I'm making more money now than I've ever made, why does it feel like I'm falling behind? I thought I was doing something wrong. Maybe I was spending too much. Maybe I wasn't disciplined enough. Maybe everyone else had figured something out that I hadn't. But here's what I eventually discovered. I wasn't failing. I was experiencing something that's been engineered into the American economy for over 50 years, a system where the numbers go up, GDP grows, the stock market breaks records, unemployment stays low, and yet the average person feels squeezed, anxious, and quietly exhausted by money, not because they're bad with money, but because the way prosperity gets measured has almost nothing to do with the way regular people actually experience their lives. And once I understood that, everything clicked. So today, I want to walk you through exactly what's happening. Not to make you angry, though you probably will be, but because understanding this is the first step to doing something about it. The GDP illusion. Let me start with a number: GDP, gross domestic product. You hear this thrown around constantly. The economy grew 2.8% last quarter. GDP is at an all time high. The economy is strong. And technically, all of that can be true at the exact same time that you are sitting at your kitchen table, wondering how you're going to afford both the car repair and the electric bill this month. Here's why. GDP measures the total value of everything produced and sold in the economy, every transaction, every dollar that changes hands. If a hospital charges $40,000 for a surgery that could have cost $4,000 in another country, that $40,000 goes into GDP. If a family goes through a divorce and hires two lawyers, pays court fees, sells the house, moves twice, all of that economic activity counts as growth. GDP doesn't measure whether your life got better, it just measures whether money moved. And here's the part that really hit me when I first understood it. If the top 1% of earners in America see their wealth double while everyone else stays exactly the same, GDP goes up. The economy grew, the headlines say things are great, and every single person in the bottom 99% wonders why they don't feel it. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a measurement problem. We've been handed a ruler that doesn't measure what we actually care about, and then we're told to feel good or bad based on what that ruler reads. The productivity gap. Where your raise went. Here's the one that got me. This is the piece of data that I wish someone had shown me years ago because it reframes everything. From 1948 to 1973, worker productivity in America went up about 96%, and wages went up about 91%, almost perfectly in sync. You worked more efficiently, you produced more value, you got paid more. That's how it was supposed to work. Then something changed. From 1979 to today, worker productivity went up over 60%. Wages went up about 18%. Let that sink in. You are producing dramatically more value for the companies you work for than workers did 40 years ago. Technology, systems, tools, training, you're more efficient, you're generating more profit, and your paycheck has barely budged in real terms. Where did the other 40% of that productivity go? Into corporate profits, into shareholder returns, into executive compensation that grew 1,460% since 1978, while average worker pay grew about 18%. So when I got that raise and still felt broke, it wasn't because I was bad with money. It was because my raise was a fraction of the value I was actually creating. The system had already quietly extracted the rest before I ever saw it. This isn't capitalism failing. This is a specific policy shift that happened starting in the late 1970s, the prioritization of shareholder value above all else. And the consequences of that shift are exactly what you're feeling right now in your wallet. The three costs that changed everything. Now, here's where it gets really personal, because this is what I think about when someone tells me the economy is doing great and I should feel good. There are three costs that define whether your life is stable or not: housing, healthcare, education, not coffee, not avocado toast. These three. In 1980, the median home price in America was about $47,000. The median household income was about $17,000, so a home cost roughly 2.8 times your annual income. Uncomfortable, but achievable. Today, the median home price is around $420,000. The median household income is around $75,000. That's 5.6 times your annual income, exactly double the ratio from 1980. And in cities like San Francisco, Austin, New York, Boston, we're talking 8, 10, 12 times your income. Housing didn't get twice as hard because houses got twice as nice. It got twice as hard because of a specific set of policy decisions, zoning restrictions that limit supply, tax incentives that make real estate more attractive to investors than homeowners, an entire financial system built around treating homes as assets to appreciate rather than places for people to live. Healthcare. In 1970, Americans spent about 7% of GDP on healthcare. Today, it's over 18%. We spend more per person on healthcare than any other developed nation, and we have worse outcomes than most of them. If you're a middle income family today, your health insurance premium, your deductible, your copays, they're consuming a bigger percentage of your income than at any point in modern history. Education, a year at a public 4-year university in 1980 cost about $3,000 in today's dollars. Today it costs over $10,000, and that's the public option. Private universities average over $38,000 a year. Student loan debt in America just crossed $1.7 trillion. That number used to not even exist as a meaningful economic category. Now it's defining the financial lives of an entire generation. So when someone tells me the economy is growing and I should feel better, I ask them, growing for whom? Because the three things that most directly determine whether a family is financially stable have gotten dramatically more expensive relative to income, and no amount of GDP growth changes that lived reality. The illusion of low unemployment. Let's talk about the other number everyone loves to cite, unemployment. When unemployment is around 3 or 4%, we're told the labor market is strong. More people are working than ever. If you're struggling, something must be wrong with you specifically. Except the unemployment rate doesn't count you if you've given up looking for work. It doesn't count you if you're working part-time but want full-time hours. It doesn't count you if you're doing gig work but have no benefits, no stability, and no path forward. The number that actually tells you what's happening is called the labor force participation rate and the underemployment rate, and those numbers tell a very different story. Tens of millions of Americans are technically employed but in jobs that don't pay a living wage, don't offer benefits, and don't lead anywhere. When I was coming up in my career, I worked 2 jobs at the same time for almost 3 years, both jobs. Neither job called me full time. So in the unemployment data, I was counted as employed twice, actually. But I couldn't afford to get sick, couldn't save anything, couldn't think past the next 2 weeks. Employed on paper, struggling in reality. That gap between the official story and the actual experience is where most Americans live. And it's been widening quietly for decades. The inflation. They don't measure. Here's the thing about official inflation numbers. The Consumer Price Index, the CPI, measures a basket of goods that's been adjusted over the decades to include substitutions. If steak gets too expensive and people switch to chicken, they swap steak for chicken in the basket. So technically inflation looks lower because people are buying chicken now, but that's not stability. That's deterioration measured as progress. The things that actually determine your quality of life, housing, healthcare, childcare, education, are either excluded from core inflation or significantly underweighted. Meanwhile, the things that have gotten cheaper over time, electronics, clothing manufactured overseas, get heavier weighting. So the official inflation number comes out at 3%, and you look at your actual life, your rent went up 9%, your health insurance went up 7%, your grocery bill is up 15%, your car insurance just jumped 22% in Sykes, and you think, am I going crazy? The gap between official inflation and what regular people actually experience every month is one of the most significant disconnected realities in modern American economic life. I started tracking my own personal inflation rate about 4 years ago. Every category I actually spend money on, food, rent, insurance, utilities, gas, medical, my personal inflation rate in those years ran consistently 2 to 3 points higher than whatever the official CPI was reporting. That doesn't seem like much until you compound it across 10 or 20 years of your working life. The wealth effect that only works for some people. There's a concept in economics called the wealth effect. The idea is that when people feel wealthier, they spend more, and that spending drives economic growth. When the stock market goes up, people with investments feel richer and behave differently. Here's the problem. About 58% of Americans own some stock. Sounds decent until you look deeper. The top 10% of Americans own about 93% of all stocks. The bottom 50% own less than 1%. So when the stock market goes up 20%, 30%, 40%, the wealth effect is almost entirely concentrated in the top 10% of the population. The average American with maybe $5,000 in a 401k doesn't feel meaningfully wealthier when the market runs. But they absolutely feel poorer when groceries, gas, rent, and insurance go up, because those costs hit everyone equally regardless of your net worth. This is the asymmetry that explains the disconnect. Good economic news disproportionately benefits people who already have wealth. Bad economic news disproportionately hits people who don't. And when someone asks why you feel poor despite a booming economy, this asymmetry is the core of the answer. What actually changed, and when I want to be specific about this, because I think the history matters. For most of American history, from roughly the end of World War II through the early 1970s, economic growth was broadly shared. The middle class expanded, union membership was high, wages tracked productivity, a single income could support a family, own a home, send kids to college, and retire with dignity. That wasn't a myth, that was real, and it was common. Then a few things shifted. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 broke the post war economic model. Stagflation, high inflation plus slow growth, forced a rethinking of everything. In 1980, a new economic philosophy came into dominance: lower taxes on top earners and corporations, deregulation of financial markets, deliberate weakening of union power. The theory was that wealth created at the top would flow down through investment, job creation, spending. It would trickle down. 50 years later, we can measure whether it did. Real wages for the bottom 50% of earners have been essentially flat since 1980 after adjusting for inflation. Corporate profits as a share of GDP hit historic highs. Executive compensation exploded. The stock market returned enormous gains. And the people at the bottom of the income ladder are working harder, longer, with less security and less purchasing power than their parents did. That's not my opinion. That's the data. The psychology of feeling poor in a rich country. Here's the personal piece that I don't think gets talked about enough: the psychological toll of this disconnect. When you feel like you're doing everything right, working hard, not blowing money on stupid stuff, saving what you can, and you still feel like you're treading water, the natural human response is to look inward, to blame yourself, to wonder what's wrong with you, to feel shame about something that is structurally happening to tens of millions of people. I did that for years. I thought the problem was me. I'd read one more personal finance book, cut one more expense, try one more budgeting system, and none of it really moved the needle because the problem wasn't my behavior. The problem was that the economic environment I was operating in was fundamentally different from the environment the advice was written for. The classic personal finance advice: spend less than you earn, invest the difference, buy a house, max your 401k. That advice was written for an economy where housing was 2.8 times your income, where healthcare didn't eat 20% of your budget, where a 4-year degree didn't cost $80,000 in debt. That advice made sense in 1985. Applied today, it's like trying to use a map of a city that was redrawn 40 years ago. You're not lost because you can't read a map. You're lost because someone gave you the wrong map. Pray what you can actually do. I want to be careful here because I don't want to give you a tidy list of 5 tips that ignores the scale of what I just described. The systemic issues are real, and they're not going to be solved by your personal choices alone. But your personal choices still matter enormously within the system you're operating in. So here's how I think about it. First, stop measuring your financial health against GDP or stock market returns. Those are not your metrics. Your metrics are purchasing power, stability, optionality, and debt load. How much can your income actually buy? How many months could you survive a job loss? How many paths are open to you? How much of your future income is already spoken for by debt? Those 4 things tell you where you actually stand. Second, understand that wage growth alone will not save you if the 3 big costs keep rising faster than income: housing, healthcare, education. If you're not actively building income streams outside of your salary, whether that's investments, side income, building equity in something, the treadmill gets faster while your speed stays the same. Third, stop trying to optimize within a system that's tilted against you and start trying to change your position within that system, moving to a lower cost of living area, building skills that command premium wages, owning assets instead of just holding cash. These aren't revolutionary, but they change the math meaningfully in ways that cutting your streaming subscription will never match. Fourth, and this is the one I think about the most, reject the shame. The anxiety you feel about money is not a personality flaw. It is a rational response to a genuinely difficult economic environment. Millions of people who are doing almost everything right are still struggling. That is a structural problem. Recognizing that doesn't mean you stop taking responsibility for what you can control. It means you stop punishing yourself for conditions that were set before you ever entered the workforce. Here's where I'll leave you. The fact that you feel poorer even when the economy is growing is not a sign that you're failing. It's a sign that you're paying attention. The numbers they put on the news were never designed to capture your experience. They were designed to measure aggregate output. And aggregate output and individual well being are two completely different things that have been drifting apart for half a century. The economy can be great and your life can be hard at the same time. Both things are true. And the first step to doing anything about it is refusing to accept the gaslighting that says if the GDP is up, you should feel fine. You're not imagining it. The math is real, the history is documented, and the more clearly you understand what's actually happening, the better positioned you are to make decisions that protect you, regardless of what the headlines say. My name is Dax. This is Life Audit. If this helped you make sense of something you've been feeling but couldn't name, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me what part hit hardest, because I want to know what resonates, and I'll see you in the next one.